Altered Nostalgic Episode 1. What if Street Fighter II never came out? Street Fighter II: The World Warrior was one of the most influential video games of all time. Released by Capcom in 1991 for the arcades, the groundbreaking fighting game became the hottest port on the Super Nintendo in the early 90s. Featuring iconic characters from around the world to engage in hand-to-hand combat, Street Fighter II brought intense action to the home consoles. The stages were close and intimate, giving an almost claustrophobic feeling of mano-a-mano action. The music was incredible and memorable, all the sound effects and catchphrases were catchy, and the gameplay was smooth and addictive. But what if Street Fighter II was never released by Capcom in 1991? What if Street Fighter II never came out, and the original Street Fighter from 1987 never had any sequels? Well, to put it simply, the entire fighting game genre would have never taken off. When Street Fighter II was ported to the Super NES in 1992, it sold well over 6 million units, while the Turbo Edition in 1993 raked in over 4 million sales. Collectively, the various Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis versions of Street Fighter II released between 1992 and 1994 sold over 14 million copies. If these massive numbers never happened, game developers would have never created all the various Street Fighter clones and rip-offs over the years. Companies like Midway would have never approached Ed Boon and John Tobias to create a combat game to compete with Street Fighter II, and Mortal Kombat would have never been released in 1992. Mortal Kombat became a huge cash cow for Midway, but without the franchise's top-selling games, merchandise, TV show, and movie licenses, the company would have gone bankrupt sooner than later. Midway was losing millions of dollars by the early 2000s, and in 2009, they filed for bankruptcy. In the late 70s and 80s, Midway dominated the arcades and produced arcade machines. By the early 90s, Midway released Mortal Kombat for arcades and became financially successful. By the late 90s and early 2000s, however, Midway was losing a lot of money. Midway attributed these financial losses to the costly expense of making contemporary games and failing to create hits that expanded their consumers. However, without Mortal Kombat carrying the company throughout the 90s, Midway would have been finished 10 years earlier, around 1999 or 2000. Without Midway during the 2000s as a publisher, we do not get to see games such as Mortal Kombat vs. DCU, Area 51, The Suffering, PsyOps: The Mindgate Conspiracy, TNA Impact, and even Unreal Tournament 3, although some of these licenses would have gone to a different publisher. The entire fighting game legacy of SNK would not exist, as they would not have released a slew of fighting games directly influenced by Street Fighter II. Art of Fighting, Samurai Showdown, King of Fighters, and Fatal Fury would have never existed. Fatal Fury, which came out less than a year after Street Fighter II in late 1991, was produced by the same people who worked on the original Street Fighter from 1987. Despite this development connection, their Neo Geo division would focus on more arcadey beat-em-ups such as Sengoku from early 91, Burning Fight, and the run-and-gun shooters like Metal Slug. Even if Fatal Fury was released by SNK, Hiroshi and Takashi would have created a far less successful video game compared to Street Fighter II. This altered Fatal Fury would have more similarities to the clumsy, awkward controls of the original Street Fighter and would have vanished into obscurity. The arcade editions of Street Fighter II proved successful and continued the lifespan of the arcade experience, but without Street Fighter II or any of its incarnations or any of its rip-offs or influenced games, the arcade experience would have suffered a quicker death in the early mid-90s. Don't get it twisted, the arcades were already dying a slow death by the late 80s, after the golden era of the late 70s and early mid-80s. Fighting games, however, such as Killer Instinct, Tekken, Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter, and Virtua Fighter helped keep the arcade experience on life support during the early mid-90s. If Street Fighter 2 never came out, those arcade machines would be flooded by Final Fight-style beat-em-ups and railway shooters. It would mean less reason to visit the arcades without fighting games, and home consoles would dominate the 90s to even greater degree. The PS1 wouldn't get Tekken games, and Sega wouldn't have their Virtua Fighter and Soul Calibur games, but these consoles were filled with enough action, RPG, platforming, racing, and adventure games to keep the fans happy. Nintendo wouldn't get Killer Instinct for Super Nintendo or Game Boy, and obviously the Xbox One today would never get a Killer Instinct game. Microsoft themselves wouldn't have the success of the DOA series because Dead or Alive would have never been released. This means no DOA Extreme Beach Volleyball games, which really would have sucked. I love DOA Extreme 2. Smash Bros. And PlayStation All-Stars wouldn't exist because the Outfoxes by Namco would have never been created the way it was. It's possible that the Outfoxes could have been released in a different style without the presentation of a 2D fighting game, a different health meter system, and resembled more like a traditional beat-em-up with weapons. Without Street Fighter 2, the closest thing we would get to fighting games today would be beat-em-ups and hack-and-slash games. Titles like Final Fight, Streets of Rage, God of War, God Hand, Beatdown, Devil May Cry, Dynasty Warriors, and Fist of the North Star, Ken's Rage would be the closest we would get to the fighting game experience. Of course, fighting game adaptations of popular fighting-based anime like Dragon Ball Z and Naruto would be a lot less technical and probably more beat-em-up in presentation. Well, maybe. Perhaps they would have been the closest to Street Fighter 2 in concept, but for some reason, I can't help but feel like their gameplay would be more similar to something like Pokemon. Without Street Fighter 2's example, Dragon Ball Z and Naruto would have been tactical combat games or turn-based strategy with action elements, as opposed to the frenetic and fast-paced action of an actual fighting game. How about Capcom itself? Where would they be without Street Fighter 2? Capcom, in the best case scenario, would have continued producing video games, but they would be mostly known for franchises like Resident Evil, Mega Man, Devil May Cry, Monster Hunter, Breath of Fire, Bionic Commando, and Dead Rising. We wouldn't see Hadouken references in their games like Mega Man X, and of course we would have never gotten crossover fighting games like Street Fighter Cross Tekken, or Marvel vs. Capcom. We wouldn't have seen Capcom produce fighting games based on Marvel characters such as X-Men Children of the Atom and Marvel superheroes from the mid-90s. The original Street Fighter itself would be some obscure title on their Capcom Classics collection, an outdated, awkward playing video game that we wouldn't consider as anything important. Of course, we would have never gotten any live-action movies or anime based on Street Fighter as well during the 90s and 2000s. If Street Fighter 2 never existed, the state of 90s gaming would have been less exciting. Street Fighter 2 ushered in an era of fighting game franchises which hang on to this day, with modern titles such as Mortal Kombat X, Tekken Tag Tournament 2, Super Smash Bros. Wii U, and Street Fighter V. Although not nearly as popular as its glory years in the 90s, the genre has maintained a cult following of supporters who grew up with these franchises. Every single contemporary fighting game we've seen throughout the years can trace its lineage directly to Capcom's greatest sequel. The character designs, the gameplay, the controls, the presentation, even the health meter and the countdown timer greatly improved the original Street Fighter from 1987 and became one of the most influential video games in history with Street Fighter 2. Street Fighter II was the ultimate video game representation of a fictionalized mixed martial arts competition, a collection of the world's greatest fighters entering a tournament to win the ultimate prize. Without Street Fighter II, video gaming as we know it would have been much more boring, in my opinion. This episode of The Altered Nostalgic is brought to you by The Review Space. For more videos, please check out youtube.com/TheReviewSpace. Thanks for watching.